Buddy, it's good to see you, and I look forward to meeting you all Saturday morning. So I'm Kurt Leuschner, and hopefully you're in the right Zoom. This is Birds of Anza Borrego, and you're probably muted right now, which is fine, but if you want to unmute yourself for this first part, you can, because I'm going to give you a chance to ask questions. We're going to talk about the logistics of the weekend first before we launch into the PowerPoint. So we're doing obviously a lecture tonight, something we normally may have done on Friday night in the past. So that means you're kind of on your own Friday to arrive when you wish to Borrego Springs. Borrego Springs is a really cool town. And there's lots of interesting places to eat, Mexican restaurants and other places. So you can ask me questions about that afterward if you have any. But I'll be joining you guys Saturday morning at 7:15. So both days, Saturday and Sunday, we're going to meet at 7:15 a.m. at the Borrego Desert Nature Center. Okay, so that's not the state park. It's actually a little nature center and bookshop that is just off what they call the Christmas Circle, which is sort of the center of town. So when you come into Borrego Springs, you'll see this big roundabout, which they call the Christmas Circle. And just up from the circle, a couple doors down, as you're heading up towards the state park, on the right, that's where the Borrego Desert Nature Center is. And there's a little parking lot there. So we'll park in the back and start to assemble there at 7:15 on Saturday morning. They have a little native plant garden in the back there. So if you get there early, you can check it out. We'll probably do a little bird watching there ourselves once we get started before we head out. And so 7:15 each day. And it's right next to a place called Carly's, which is kind of like a restaurant / bar. So you'll see a big sign that says Carly's right off the circle there. And just behind that is the parking lot where we meet. There shouldn't be anybody there at that time of day, really. I checked the weather, and you probably did too. It looks fantastic for the weekend. Highs in the low 80s. And probably even cooler where we're going, because we're heading up to the mountains on Saturday, and then lows in the 50s at night. So it should be a really nice weekend weather-wise. So 7:15 each day. So Saturday is our sort of our big day where we'll be out most of the day. We're going to be driving a big loop, about 75 miles on this loop. Heading up to a town called Julian. And of course, we'll be stopping at places along the way on our way to Julian, and then we'll be stopping on places after Julian on our way back into Borrego Springs. And so we want to get the number of cars down to as few as possible for obvious reasons. I know we're in some weird times right now with social distancing, but if you can carpool or you're willing to carpool, you know, just think about it, and we'll sort that out on Saturday morning. But the more we can get people to ride together, the fewer cars we'll have to deal with when we're parking alongside the roads in tight situations. We don't really need any kind of four-wheel drive or even high clearance. So pretty much everywhere we're going to go is passable by most cars. So you shouldn't have to worry too much about that. But if you do have high clearance, it never hurts to have when you're out in the desert. So anyway, I'll have some radios too, so we can distribute those and we can kind of communicate along the way, maybe see some bighorn sheep and other things. And you should also bring a lunch on Saturday, because we'll be lunching at a secret spot up near Julian. So bring your coolers and your drinks and snacks and lunch items So you'll be happy throughout the day. We should get back into Borrego Springs on Saturday around 4:30-ish. We always try to get back a little before 5 so that you'll have a chance to go into the bookstore, the Nature Center bookstore there where we parked our cars. They have a fantastic selection. And then Saturday evening, you're on your own, but you know, some of us may want to try to meet for dinner, and that's something we can arrange on Saturday. Some of us are camping in the group campsite number 3 at Borrego Palm Canyon. That's where I'll be on Saturday night, State Park Campground. And then Sunday, we'll also meet at 7:15, same time, same place. Only this time, it's a half day. So we'll finish around lunchtime, and we're gonna stay close. We're gonna stay local and hit some different spots in and around Borrego Springs where we might be able to see some interesting birds, including sort of the sand dune area out by the Borrego dump, where we have a chance to maybe see a Lacan's thrasher. So that's what we'll do on Sunday, and finish around lunchtime so you can have lunch wherever you want, stay later or head home, whatever you need to do. Are there any questions from you? You can unmute yourself and ask me now. Anything about Borrego Springs or logistics or what to bring or what to expect? I'll have a spotting scope. Nikki, you have a question?
I was going to ask, should I bring a scope?
Well, it never hurts to have more than one. Yeah. So I'm not much of a scope person. I bring it because I have to for the group. But I'm happy to do that. But I don't use a scope too much. Other people love to use their scopes all the time. So please bring scopes if you want to, and use them as much as you want. There's not a lot of places we're going to go where it's necessary. Although if we're trying to see a bighorn sheep on a hillside, you know, it can be handy for sure. And when we go to Lake Henshaw and we're kind of scanning the lake for water birds, it'll be handy there too towards the end of the day on Saturday. Otherwise, a pair of binoculars is all you pretty much need, and a field guide or a bird app on your phone. Any questions about the birds we might see, or any special requests people have right now? Or you can give me those on Saturday.
Question.
Yeah.
Breakfast on Sunday morning. Are places open before 7:15 up there for breakfast?
Yeah, I don't have all the times memorized, but I know there's a couple of places that are open early. One of them is, of course, with COVID and everything, I don't know if times have changed there in Borrego Springs. It's been a while since I've been there, but there's a Kendall's Cafe in what they call the mall, which opens at 6 or 6:30 at least. And there's another place up the road that usually is open by about 6:30 that has coffee and breakfast items. If any of you know, you can chime in too. So we'll, if any of you get there early on Friday, and some of you probably will, maybe you can scope out some of those places and ask them when they're open on Saturday. And that'll be really great information to have for us Saturday morning when well, I guess it might be too late for some of you, but so I'd say check in on Friday. But yeah, there should be some places open. And if you're a few minutes late after 7:15, we're not going to leave without you. We're going to be in the parking lot for at least 15 minutes, maybe more, because we're gonna walk around and see a few birds before we take off. And it'll take a few minutes to get us organized too. So if you're running late with breakfast and it's 7:15, don't panic. Just come on down, and you'll be fine. Other questions?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be one of the campers out at the group campsite, and I just want to give you all like full disclosure on me. I'm a total noob, so I might be asking for help. But I was happy for the experience and brave enough to just choose to camp instead of getting a hotel.
Well, you can do it. It's a lot of fun. You know, bring a sleeping bag and a pillow and some kind of mat to sleep on or cot. And you can sleep out under the stars even. It should be a really fantastic night sky. So you don't even need a tent necessarily.
Good to know.
But yeah, get there early and then you can kind of check out the campground and get your bearings. And it's a pretty neat place. Camped there many times. And yeah.
Sorry, Eric and Mary Martinez, we could take 2 people in my FJ Cruiser with us both days. So
great. I'm sure you'll have some takers. I wouldn't mind riding with somebody too. It'll make it easier for me. So I might be one of your passengers. We'll see.
No problem.
Thank you. Other questions before we start the PowerPoint? And you can also put questions in the chat as we go along. If you think of something. And I'll try to keep an eye on that. It says, is there potable water at the campground or do we need to bring lots of bottled water? Well, it's always good to have a supply of water of your own. So do bring water, but would I drink the water at the campground? I don't know. It's probably okay tap water, but bring bottled water for drinking and then I'd say use the campground water for everything else. Showering and brushing your teeth, that kind of stuff. I can't vouch for the water there, but it should be decent. It's a state park. But anyway, you can put questions in the chat as we go along if you think of other things. And then, of course, at the end, I'll stick around until everybody checks out so you can ask questions all night long if you want. And then email me between now and Saturday because you're going to think of something tomorrow or Thursday. And go ahead and email me and I'll tell you whether you need to bring that or not or whatever's on your mind. But maybe we should get to the birds. What do you think? So let's talk about migration and birds in the Anza Borrego Desert. We're kind of at the end of the migration season right now, but we're bound to run into some true migrants that are just passing through even in late October. And of course, we should see some birds that have migrated to the desert to spend the winter at Borrego Springs. Plus, we'll see resident species. So we're going to see a whole mix of bird species this weekend. And as we see the species, we can talk about what their status is. Are they a migrant? Are they a resident? Are they here for the winter? Or what the deal is. So we'll go through that as we go along as well. I want to thank Steve Myers for supplying many of these photos, including this one, which is of white pelicans, actually. Those are American white pelicans migrating. Maybe they're heading to the Salton Sea. That was a few years ago when the Salton Sea still had fish in it. Unfortunately, there are no fish in the Salton Sea anymore, or very few. So white pelican numbers are down. But we might see some at Lake Henshaw when we're up there on Saturday. All right, let me try to get this going. Okay, so we're gonna talk about migration, give you a little background on that. Migration and to migrate means to go somewhere and to come back. And if you're just going on a one-way trip, that's more of an emigration instead of a migration. And if you're just moving in a more random fashion, maybe expanding your range, we might call that a dispersal because it doesn't happen on a regular basis necessarily. These are just some epic migrations from around the world to get you thinking about migration, like the wildebeest that go from Kenya down to Tanzania and then back up to Kenya every year, crossing the Mara River. So if you ever get a chance to see that, it's quite a sight. Closer to home in Alaska, we've got caribou that still migrate from their summer to their winter range and back up in Alaska. And right now, even through our desert, although most go along the coast, monarchs are migrating south, heading either to Southern California where they'll spend the winter, or some of them may go down into Mexico. And the ones that you've learned about over the years, those ones are passing through Texas on their way to central Mexico. Monarchs, as you know, feed on milkweed. Their numbers are at an all-time low, sadly. So we need people to plant more milkweed. So do your part and find out what kind of milkweed is native to your area. And you can always email me to ask these questions, and then plant native milkweed in your yards. That will help the monarchs on their amazing journey, thousands of miles. Sea turtles do some epic migrations under the water. These are GPS signals and tracks showing you the thousands of miles that some of them cover in a year, always returning to the same beach where they were born. Pretty amazing. Salmon, of course, migrate upstream. Some species do. And bats. We've got 18 species of bats in the area. And all of our bats in our desert, not including Arizona, but the California desert, are insect-eating bats. So they're really good to have around because a single bat can eat thousands of little mosquito and other flies every night. And so most of our bats species have migrated south this time of year, but we may see a bat or two this weekend. Do some bat watching. This is a fun one over on Christmas Island out in the Pacific Ocean. The crabs migrate from one side of the island to the other, certain times of the year, back and forth. And the longest migrations belong to the humpback whale. Thousands and thousands of miles every year under the ocean. Painted lady is one of our most common butterflies, and we may see some this weekend. Their movement is more of an emigration. It's more of a one-way movement, although some of them do come back to some extent. So it's kind of a mix of emigration and migration. But a lot of the painted lady butterflies that we see in the desert are born in Mexico, and they're just heading north. And many of those won't come back. It's kind of a one-way trip for a lot of them. But it's our most common butterfly throughout the year. And this time of year in the fall, we sometimes see black witch moths showing up at the porch light. They look like a big bat. Maybe you've seen one. Maybe you mistook it for a bat. But these black witch moths are born in Mexico, and they migrate north. Well, it's not migrate, it's more of an emigration. They disperse north. And some of them go as far north as Canada. September, October, November is also tarantula time in the desert. So watch for those around your campsite in Borrego, Palm Canyon. But don't be afraid of them, they won't hurt you. The males are the ones that you see crawling around this time of year, searching for the females who are hiding inside their burrows. The females can live 20 to 30 years. The males have a very short lifespan because of their nomadic tendencies. So if you see a tarantula crawling around, it's probably a male. Dragonflies do quite a bit of moving around. It's not really a migration, but they can occur many miles from water. So we might see some dragonflies out in the middle of nowhere. Some birds do eat them. And dragonflies, on the other hand, eat lots of mosquitoes. And finally, to the birds, the long distance champions got to be the Arctic tern, which essentially goes from pole to pole and back every year. That's quite a migration, 44,000 miles. So they're the champions. Most records of Arctic terns occur off the coast. However, the Salton Sea has recorded Arctic tern on occasion. So one could take a wrong turn and end up over Borrego. You never know. So here's the migratory pathways that many birds tend to take or concentrate themselves in. We happen to live along the Pacific Flyway. And Borrego Springs, where we're going to be this weekend, is right smack in the middle of that flyway. So we're hoping to see some of those birds that are on the move. And some of them, like the mountain plover, for example, are going as far south as southern South America. Others are going to stop short in northern South America or Central America, Costa Rica, Panama. And many of our migrants are just dipping down into Mexico, and they'll go about halfway down and spend the winter somewhere in the middle of Mexico. So it just depends on the species. Timing of migration. In January, we start to see the first birds heading north, and usually these are vultures, followed by swallows and then shorebirds. So they're very early migrants. Other migrants like flycatchers, especially the willow flycatcher, don't pass through until late June heading north. And then most birds are going to be concentrated somewhere in the middle. So we're talking about April 1st to May 1st is a pretty peak time for spring migration. These are some of the flycatchers that pass through the Anza Borrego Desert, both in the spring and the fall, heading south. The endangered southwestern willow flycatcher on the left, the western wood pewee in the middle, and the olive-sided flycatcher on the right. Each is a little bit bigger than the previous, with the olive-sided being the largest of the three here. The olive-sided, notice, also has a shorter tail, and it has more of a vested appearance on the chest, and they prefer burn areas. So I guess one good thing about these wildfires is that it's providing more habitat for olive-sided flycatchers and other burn specialists. So we'll be watching for these kinds of birds this weekend. We have a chance at maybe catching a late pewee in October. Now, if every member of a species migrates, we call that a complete migrant. If some members of a species migrate and others don't, then we say they're partial migrants. And if species are just kind of moving up and down the slopes, depending on the weather or food, we might refer to them as an altitudinal migrant. So just getting you familiar with these terms. And then finally, we have eruptive or irregular migrants. And this can vary year to year or decade to decade. And it usually depends on food availability and weather. Climate change is, a newer thing that birds are having to deal with. Eruptive migrants. Now, if a bird species migrates at night, we call them a night migrant. And it turns out that most bird species actually do migrate at night, believe it or not. If they migrate only during the day, then they're a daytime migrant. And I'll be pointing out examples of these. And if they kind of hit the in-between times, late afternoon, early evening, and early morning, but not during the night per se, and not during the middle of the day, then we call them a crepuscular migrant. So here's an example of a crepuscular migrant, a Vaux's swift. And sometimes we see these flying through Borrego Springs in October, heading south, and they look like bats. And we're most likely to see them on Saturday or Sunday morning between, 8 and 10 in the morning. Because like I said, they don't fly in the middle of the day and they don't fly in the middle of the night either. But sometimes we see them in the morning and they look a lot like a bat. And if you grew up back east, they're going to look a lot like the chimney swift that you're familiar with, sort of our Western version of the chimney swift. A lot of our colorful bird friends, like the summer tanager on the left and the Bullock's oriole on the right, are night migrants. And they migrate only at night. And during the day, they stop over in little green oases that they find out in the desert. And those are the kind of places we're going to be checking this weekend. And if we're lucky, then maybe we'll run into one of these night migrants that's spending the day in a patch of mesquite somewhere. Bluebirds are complete migrants and somewhat altitudinal in their migration, although there is also a southerly movement of the western bluebird. But this time of year, we see lots of western bluebirds in the desert. They come down from the mountains. And if it's one of those irregular or eruptive years, then we can sometimes see mountain bluebirds in the desert. It's been many years since we had an eruption of mountain bluebirds, so we're kind of due for one of these winters. But so far, there aren't any indications that it's going to happen this winter. We'll see. But I bet you anything we'll see western bluebirds this weekend. Very common winter resident and migrant of all of Southern California is the ruby-crowned kinglet. And so we should run into one or two of these somewhere along the way that have just arrived from the north. Cedar waxwing is one of the first signs that fall is here in the desert, is the arrival of the cedar waxwings. I have seen a couple already this fall. They usually occur in flocks, which is called a museum. So we'll be watching for waxwings and checking their vents for one that might have a reddish color, and that could be a Bohemian waxwing, which is a real rarity that sometimes mixes in with the cedar waxwing flocks. Another night migrant that could be flying over our heads right now as we speak is the western tanager, heading south to places like Panama, Costa Rica, southern Mexico. Other complete migrants that migrate at night include our orioles, Scott's oriole and hooded oriole. Now, some Scott's orioles remain in the desert during winter. And so sometimes we'll see a Scott's oriole in or near the Borrego Palm Canyon campground. So something we can watch for this weekend, Scott's oriole. Hooded orioles should be south of the border by now, but sometimes there's a late one that we run into in October. Hooded orioles like to nest in palm trees, and here's a nest of one in the upper right. They'll weave their nest behind a palm frond. So try not to trim your palm trees, just leave them alone. Some birds actually migrate to the desert during the summer. It's kind of the opposite of what most of the other birds and people do. They flee the desert during the summer. But these birds, the ash-throated flycatcher, the western kingbird, and the white-winged dove are summer residents of the Borrego Springs area. Sometimes we'll catch a late lingering western kingbird in October. So we'll be watching for one that hasn't headed south yet. Same thing with the ash-throated flycatcher. Most of them should be south of the border, but there's a few that might not be. And white-winged doves also are deciding, at least some of them are, to stay in Borrego Springs all winter. So we almost always find white-winged doves even in the winter now in the desert. And that includes Palm Desert where I live too. There's some that are hanging around all winter now. Now the brown-headed cowbird, since it evolved to follow the bison across the prairies originally, is actually a daytime migrant, not a nighttime migrant. And it's also a parasitic bird. So the female lays her eggs in other birds' nests like the Bell's vireo. The least Bell's vireo is an endangered species that's been a victim of cowbirds. As humans expand their range, cowbirds go along with us now. And so we have inadvertently aided cowbirds in taking over the desert, for example. And as a result, other birds like the Bell's vireo are on the decline. So we're going to see a cowbird trap, just like the one you see here in the photo on Saturday. I'll show you one and we'll talk about how it works and what's being done to kind of help these Bell's vireos from being victimized so often. The good news is that the program is working and Bell's vireo's numbers are on the rise. Now, not all owls migrate, but some do. And believe it or not, burrowing owls, at least some of them, not all of them, some of them migrate. So they're a partial migrant, which means some populations are resident year-round and others migrate or move south for the winter. Like, for instance, the burrowing owls that live up in Canada and northern US, they get the heck out of there when it gets cold. And you can't blame them. And they head south and join their southern cousins for the winter. There's a few burrowing owls in the Borrego Springs area. We're always very lucky to find one. And you have to be extremely lucky to find one actually on migration, although it does happen from time to time. There was a burrowing owl seen just 2 weeks ago along Zizek's Road. That's where the Desert Studies Center is, up in Baker. And that was surely a migrant that somebody happened to kind of catch on its way south. Poor wills are partial migrants. Most of them head south to Mexico and are gone from our area by now, but a few of them, we're still unsure how many though, but a few of them stay around the desert, and it's actually the only bird that's known to truly hibernate. Some birds go into kind of a partial hibernation. They call it torpor, hummingbirds and swifts, for example, but the poor will has been fully documented to go into a complete true hibernation mode. And this was confirmed back in the 1940s near Desert Center, not too far from Anza Borrego. And in the lower right, you can see Dr. Edmund Yeager peering into a little crevice in the granite rock where a migrating poor will was found back in the 1940s. And there's an article in National Geographic about that. So we'll keep our eyes out for poor wills. You guys who are camping at campsite number 3 on Friday and Saturday night, I want you to listen for poor wills and report to me on Saturday and let me know if you heard any. That's what you're going to be listening for. And you might hear a great horned owl or something else at night too. So keep your ears open. Or you might hear the screeching scream of a barn owl flying overhead. Kestrels are partial migrants, so there's plenty of resident kestrels in the area, plus migrating ones and wintering ones, so they're all mixed up this time of year. Small falcon. Coots are also partial migrants. We'll probably see some in a couple of the water places we visit. Not a rare bird. I've seen a lot of northern flickers already this winter. So they have arrived. They're woodpeckers that migrate and also head down the slopes. And they're starting to show up in our desert. So we'll be looking for those as well as American robins. Some irregular and more unusual migrants are the Lewis's woodpecker and mountain quail. You never know where you might see a Lewis's woodpecker, so we'll always be on the lookout for it. There's one place in particular on Saturday afternoon that we've seen them before, so I'll point that out when we get near it, and you can watch for them. And mountain quail, same thing. On Saturday, we'll be up in the higher portions of the park where mountain quail have been known to occur, but they're really hard to see, but they're up there. And they do move down the slopes, both of these species, in the fall and winter. Even where I live, again, in Palm Desert, mountain quail sometimes come all the way to the valley floor when it gets really cold up above. Some other altitudinal type migrants that could be seen in the desert starting this time of year, especially once we have a cold snap, are the band-tailed pigeon and the red crossbill. Dark-eyed juncos also come down the slopes starting this time of year, and some of them are also heading south, more of a true migration. This could be the world's shortest migration, about 100 yards these nutcrackers move. They pretty much stick to the high altitudes, and it takes a pretty severe storm to drive them down, even 100 yards. So I don't think we'll see one this weekend, but again, you never know what might happen in the fall in the desert. More likely, we would run into something like a red-breasted nuthatch. And if it happens to be one of those eruptive years for nuthatches, which happens every few years, then they can be all over the place. But normally you go up into the mountains to see a species like the red-breasted nuthatch. Another owl that migrates, again, at least some of them do, is the long-eared owl. But it's a very irregular migration. It doesn't happen every year. Not all members of the species do it. So you never know. They look a lot like a great horned owl on a diet. And a place that we're going to go Saturday morning called Tamarisk Grove used to be the go-to place to see long-eared owls back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Then they kind of disappeared and the barn owls moved in. And then lately there's been a long-eared owl or two that has occurred at Tamarisk Grove. So cross your fingers. Maybe we'll get lucky and see one this weekend. It's one of the few owls that flocks. In fact, it's pretty much the only species I know or can think of that can occur in flocks. And one time I saw a flock of 60 of these owls, which was pretty amazing. Here's an owl that doesn't flock, but they do move down from the mountains irregularly. So again, not every year. And sometimes a single bird will end up in a desert backyard. So Borrego Springs has had a few records of the saw-whet owl over the years, as have other desert communities like Palm Desert. So it's always something that could happen or that could see in a place like Borrego Springs. Tiny little owl. Another eruptive migrant, it's hard to predict, but it's going to be in the area we'll be at is the Lawrence's goldfinch. In fact, I saw my very first Lawrence's goldfinch in Anza Borrego Desert State Park. So it is one of the places where you might get a chance to see them. We're more likely to see the lesser goldfinch, but we've got a 50-50 chance of finding a Lawrence's goldfinch this weekend. Really pretty bird. The Fennel Peppers are very unusual in many ways. They eat mistletoe berries. They nest 2 times a year in 2 different habitats, both in the desert and on the coast. They have more of an east-west migration, at least some of them do, instead of north-south. They're the only member of their tropical silky flycatcher family in our area. So just a lot of neat things about them. So I hope we see some, and I'm sure we will. And we'll talk more about them this weekend, the Fennel Pepper. Leapfrog migration. So when birders and field ornithologists ban birds, catch birds, they often pluck a single feather. It doesn't hurt the birds and it grows back, but there's a lot of useful information in that feather. And it's kind of like a human hair. A feather is it documents where that bird has been because you can find certain isotopes in those feathers that can tell you where the birds have been and in what month of the year. You can use isotope charts of North America to compare the feather growth and those isotopes to latitudinal locations. So for instance, with this new information, researchers have found out that Wilson's warblers, for example, the ones that summer in Alaska, for example, actually winter further south than Wilson's warblers that summer in, say, California. And this information wasn't really known until they started plucking these feathers and were able to prove it. We didn't know exactly where Wilson's warblers were going from any given nesting population. Now we do. And you might say, well, why is that important? It's important because if you're trying to protect a certain habitat in Alaska or maybe down in Mexico, then you want to know where your Wilson's warblers that are nesting in Alaska are going for the winter. And this information is now available. It's in those feathers. And then you can partner with somebody in Mexico who's trying to do the same thing and vice versa. And save those 2 habitats. And so we call this leapfrog migration. And a lot of birds, it turns out, and here's a couple more examples of warblers we might see this weekend. A lot of these birds are what we call leapfrog migrants, with the Alaska ones heading further south than the more centrally located ones. So it turns out that these 2 warblers here, some of them at least, stay in the US for the winter. Yellow-rumped warblers are super common all winter throughout Southern California. And orange crown warblers are more common than you think. They just are a little more elusive and hide more. But we might see both of these species this weekend. We'll definitely see yellow-rumped warblers, but they won't look as bright as this photograph at this time of the year. And we'll talk more about leapfrog migration this weekend. Roadrunner, it's always fun to run into a Roadrunner in the desert, and I hope that we do. There's a few that are right around town. So those of you who are arriving on Friday, especially if you get into town a little early, you'll probably see a Roadrunner out in front of Carly's or at your campsite or just running down the main drag in town. And you can let us know that on Saturday. They don't migrate, Roadrunners. At least nobody's proven that they do, but they are less active in the winter. So they do kind of seem to disappear, but I think they're just a little less active. Some thrashers migrate, others don't. The specialty thrasher of Anza Borrego is the LeConte thrasher. We'll be looking for them on Sunday morning. Cross your fingers and your toes if you want to see one of these thrashers. So the chances are less than 50%, but we're going to give it a try. But they don't migrate. They're year-round residents. So they're there in the fall, they're there in the winter. They're just harder to find because they're not singing. Another species called the Bendire's thrasher does migrate. So they're down in Mexico by this time of the year. But you can see Bendire's thrashers more commonly in Joshua Tree or Mojave National Preserve in the summer. Why do birds migrate? Why take a chance and migrate? Well, there's a lot of reasons to migrate when you think about it. They want to head north in the summer because they want to take advantage of that midnight sun where they can just feed on mosquitoes and abundant food sources 24 hours a day because they need a lot of food to raise their young. And on the reverse end of that, they want to get away from those areas in the winter because the winters in places like Alaska and Canada, for example, are pretty harsh, as some of you know. And so they head south to find warmer climates and food. It's basically all about the food, going to where the food is or going away from where it isn't. How far are they flying a day? You know, it's all over the place. It varies, of course, from species to species and day to day, depending on the weather. But a typical day might be 75, 100 miles for a migrating bird. But when conditions are really good, certain birds can travel over 300 miles a day. And if conditions are poor, then they might be lucky to just go 10 or 20 miles in a day. So it just kind of depends on how they're feeling, if they're in a hurry, and the weather is a big factor. They tend to be in a much faster hurry, though, in the spring compared to the fall. So here we are in the fall now, and the fall migration is very spread out over many, many months. And birds are not in a hurry, so they can take their time and sometimes linger in a place like Anza Borrego Desert State Park. So we're hoping to run into some of these lingering migrants. That's a young blue-footed booby, by the way, which does occur from time to time at the Salton Sea, which is just down the road from where we're going to be. So you never know when you might run into one of these blue-footed boobies out in the desert. There was a year, it was about 6 or 7 years ago now, maybe some of you remember it, but we had a blue-footed booby invasion and they were everywhere. And there was a day down at the Salton Sea where they counted 106 blue-footed boobies in one day, and I'm sure they missed some. But that was an exceptional year, and we haven't seen a year like that since. So young birds tend to wander and get lost. And so when you see a bird that's off course, and maybe we'll see 1 or 2 or 3 this weekend that are really off course, they tend to be young birds on their first migration, which makes sense because they don't know their way. Females also tend to winter further south than males. You might think the males would be nice and let the females have the better wintering spots closer to home, you might say, but it's the opposite. The males are the ones that are in a hurry to get back to the breeding grounds, so they don't want to fly south, or at least as far as the females. Some weird birds, again, show up in the fall in the desert. And here's a couple of weird, odd birds that have showed up in Borrego Springs over the years. The Xanthus's hummingbird from Mexico and the broad-billed hummingbird. both have occurred at bird feeders in Borrego Springs. So check your hummingbirds carefully this weekend. You never know. As I mentioned earlier, most birds migrate at night rather than by day. And this includes the vireos and warblers and sparrows, as you'll see. And they usually don't flock either. They're kind of on their own up there in the night sky. There's really no advantage to flocking when you're flying at night. So although they may run into some of their friends and hang out with them, especially in the morning when they pitch in somewhere, they're really kind of on their own up in the sky there, using the stars mostly for navigation and magnetic fields. The two resident hummingbirds in the Borrego area are the Costas and the Anna's hummingbirds. So start with these two, learn them. Some of them are migrants, some of them are resident year-round. We should see both this weekend. Hummingbirds do migrate, at least some of them do, not all of them. Almost all of our North American hummingbirds migrate to get away from the cold weather. The ones that live in the tropics don't, because they don't need to. I mean, if they live in Costa Rica and there's flowers all year long, why would they leave? So they don't. Some of our hummingbirds just go short distances up and down the slopes, like Anna's hummingbirds. And other hummingbirds are known to migrate long distance, like the rufous hummingbird. So if we see a rufous hummingbird this weekend, it'll definitely be one that's on its way south to Mexico and may have started all the way up in Alaska. So that little hummingbird might travel 3,000 miles on a single trip. And back east, the ruby-throated hummingbird also travels 1,000 miles or more and 500 miles nonstop over the Gulf of Mexico. Nothing but water and no place to stop. And they go about 25 miles an hour over the Gulf. So do the math. That's 4 times 5, was that 20 hours? And they hope they don't run into a storm or some kind of headwind. And they shift into 5th gear. They got a 5th gear, these hummingbirds. So instead of the normal 80 beats a second, they slow down to 60 beats a second to save fuel. And of course, they've got to fatten up as best they can to get across the Gulf of Mexico. And on our side of the country, the rufous hummingbird has to do the same to cross some of those desert stretches. It can be 100 miles, hundreds of miles. This rufous hummingbird didn't make it. It was a young bird. The loggerhead shrike nailed him and had him for lunch, unfortunately for him. How high do birds fly when they migrate? Again, it's all over the place. If you're looking for world records, 37,000 feet is the highest that's ever been seen. That was a vulture, but that's not normal. Hawks certainly can fly high, and sometimes they do, but they generally stay around 5,000 feet unless they need to fly higher to get over mountain ranges. Different types of migrants. So soaring migrants are those that migrate by day and use rising air currents to help keep them aloft rather than their wings. Powered migrants are actually using their wings to power them along. And powered migrants can fly either during the day or at night. All night migrants are powered migrants. Here's one of these soaring migrants that's kind of famous in Borrego Springs, the Swainson's hawk. It turns out that every year in March and April, so you should try to come back to Borrego Springs in March and April. Hundreds, not hundreds, but thousands, when you add it all up, of Swainson's hawks funnel through and move through Borrego Springs. And if you time it just right, on one of those lucky days, you can see hundreds or even over 1,000 Swainson's hawks coming in to Borrego Springs in the evening. So they have Hawk Watch volunteers out there every morning and every night. And you can learn where those spots are. I'll point them out to you this weekend. And you can go join the Hawk Watchers and watch this spectacle every March and April. You should really try to do that sometime. There's some of these Swainson's hawks are coming all the way from Argentina. Some of them are going as far north as Canada. Others are stopping short. But it's a pretty neat thing to see. And if it's one of those wet years where there's a lot of caterpillars, that's when you're going to see tons of these Swainson's hawks moving through Borrego Springs. I usually lead a very similar weekend to the one we're going to do this weekend in March. It's not through the Desert Institute, though. It's through LA Audubon. So if you check the Los Angeles Audubon Society website, you can check their field trip schedule, and you can look for my weekend in March. It's usually the third weekend of March. And you can sign up for that. And even if you're not a member, you can sign up. And join me in March for this, or just come out on your own. In case you're wondering why it's called Swainson's hawk, this is the guy, William Swainson. He never even saw his own bird, but somebody named it after him. He was the former Attorney General of New Zealand, believe it or not. So anyway, these daytime soaring type migrants, as I mentioned, usually stay around 5,000 feet or less. These are 3 species that occur in the Borrego area or move through: the osprey, the ferruginous hawk in the upper right, and the local resident and migrant red-tailed hawk. So we'll be checking the skies and hoping to see a few hawks this weekend moving through. And maybe we'll even see a pelican or a late swallow. Most swallows have moved south by now, but there's probably a few barn swallows and maybe a tree or a violet green swallow still kicking around. They're daytime migrants. The nighttime migrants, as I mentioned, are all powered migrants, including all of our songbirds, warblers, grosbeaks. These birds tend to fly very low, which gets them into a lot of trouble at night because they'll run into skyscrapers, they'll run into power lines, they'll run into wind turbines. There's all kinds of stuff now that's in their airspace that wasn't there before. And they tend to fly quite low unless they have to get over mountains. Powered migrants can choose what altitude they want to fly at. But again, most migrants fly as low as they can get away with. This is a species, the Nuttall's woodpecker, that's becoming more common in the desert, including Borrego. So something we'll be watching for. Sometimes we see the common ladder-backed woodpecker, which is the resident one. But now we're going to have to check our woodpeckers very carefully to see if there might be a Nuttall's mixed in. Here's some other species that over the years have been expanding their range. It's more of a dispersal. It's not really a migration. You've probably noticed that great-tailed grackles occur in more areas than they used to now. Maybe they're in your neck of the woods, wherever you are. American crows on the lower left are now becoming fairly common in the deserts. They kind of follow the people. So we might even see a crow in Borrego Springs now. They're not all ravens anymore. So we'll talk about the difference between the two. And then, of course, Eurasian collared doves are everywhere these days. They're spreading like wildfire. So if you haven't noticed them, I'm sure they're wherever you live. They look like a really large mourning dove, lighter in color with a square tail and a little black half, kind of a crescent on the back of the neck. Here's a bird that Borrego Springs kind of was famous for a while. Every winter during the Christmas bird count back in, say, the 80s and 90s, and I participated in a number of those, we would see Harris's hawk on a regular basis. And then they kind of disappeared in the early 2000s for a while. And I don't know if they've really made a comeback yet, but I do have some news to report. My friend who lives up near Julian actually saw 3 Harris's hawk in his yard just last week, which is crazy. Not just 1, not 2, but 3. So a little mini eruption, you might say, is in the area. So we'll be watching for this bird. They're more common when you go to West Texas and New Mexico, and there's a small population of them in southern Arizona. And so some of those southern Arizona birds, maybe some Mexican birds, sometimes fly up to our desert area, and that's when we see them, usually in the winter. So maybe they'll make a comeback and we'll start seeing them again. Now, why would a bird migrate at night? It turns out there's a lot of good reasons when you think about it. The night air is cool. And when you're flapping those little wings, you want to stay cool because you get hot real easy. There's very few predators up there at night to get you. So less chance of being preyed upon. Bats eat insects. The night air is also very stable. So if you're a small sparrow or a warbler flapping your wings at night, you want that stable air. And by flying all night, that means you can spend the day, or at least part of it when you're not taking a rest, foraging for insects, which is what you usually feed on, and those fly during the day. So you're not wasting valuable feeding time migrating. You spend the night doing that. So, and here's another reason, maybe the most important one. Most of these little birds are using the stars and magnetic fields for navigation. And of course, they can't see the stars during the day. So there's 5 really good reasons that most birds migrate at night. Here are some of those night migrants that we always are hoping might pitch in to a little green patch in the desert so that we might find them on Saturday or Sunday morning. The Townsend's warbler, the hermit warbler, and the more elusive McGillivrary's warbler. All night migrants. They could be flying over our heads right now. These guys, same story. Sparrows, Lincoln sparrow and brewer sparrow. We'll be watching for those this weekend. And they're flying at night. A lot of these sparrows stop short. They don't go south of Mexico. So we might find little flocks of brewer sparrows and Lincoln sparrows mixed in with the very common white-crowned sparrows that, of course, winter abundantly here in Southern California. And again, you never know what might be passing through because the Salton Sea is so close to us as well, so close to Borrego. Ringbilled gull, belted kingfisher we've seen. These are all birds we've seen in the desert during fall and winter, the California gull, and then this little cackling goose, which is kind of a smaller version of the Canada goose. Gray Vireo has an interesting story that involves Anza Borrego Desert. It turns out about 20 years ago now, I need to update this slide, researchers from the San Diego Museum of Natural History discovered that gray vireos, at least a few of them, winter in Anza Borrego Desert State Park. It used to be thought they all go down to Mexico in the winter. It turns out they have a relationship with a tree called the elephant tree. And there's a grove of elephant trees still hanging on in Anza Borrego Desert State Park. And it turns out that's where these gray vireos are wintering. They're not there every winter. They're there in some winters, especially when it's a wet winter preceding, when that causes the elephant trees to fruit. And then they tend to stick around and eat the fruits or eat insects. Will we see a gray vireo this weekend? Not likely, but maybe we'll talk about it some more. There's lots of ways to study bird migration, radar and marking and mist nets and GPS tracking. I'll just go through this real quick. This is showing radar. All this green you see here on the Texas map, these are birds. These are waves of birds coming in off the Gulf of Mexico in spring and making landfall here. And a lot of them head to the first little patch of land they see, which is called High Island, Texas. I've been there a few times. This is a place you ought to go in April. And you can join all these bird watchers and see these incredible fallouts of warblers in the trees that have just crossed the Gulf of Mexico the night before. It's an amazing sight. So check it out sometime. It's called High Island. We use mist nets to catch some of these birds and put bands on them, hoping to catch them again at a later date or have somebody else catch them. And then we can kind of tell where they're going, where they've been. Unfortunately, though, not many birds are recaptured. So you can band 1,000 birds and you might only get 3 or 4 recaptures. So you don't get a lot of data for a lot of work, but it's still worth it. And we've learned a lot over the years from bird banding. If you're studying a special population, especially one that doesn't move around like these California scrub jays, you can put little dye markers or different colored bands on their legs to identify the individuals. And so that way you don't need to recapture them each time to know who you're looking at. Some of the larger birds can take a little antenna on their back, ducks, waterfowl, large birds like condors, and you can track them using radio telemetry and GPS tracking. And now GPS tracking has become so efficient, you can actually surgically implant some of these trackers into the bird. And they did this with godwits, bar-tailed godwits a few years ago, and were able to confirm for the first time that these birds are capable of flying nonstop to New Zealand, over 7,000 miles over the ocean, nonstop flying for over a week, flapping their wings. It's just amazing. And so this ability to track them 24/7 now with these implanted devices confirmed that they're not stopping. Before they were just speculating and nobody believed it. On the way back, you can see the godwits take a totally different path, and they do make a few stops along the way. And so this is important to know too, because you want to work with these people in Australia or New Guinea or in Japan or in China and Siberia to make sure that these habitats are protected so that these godwits, in this case, will have a safe place to land on their way back to Alaska. And so those partnerships are being forged as we speak to try to protect this species. But without the information about where they're going and where they're landing, then you don't know what places you need to protect. And sometimes it's too late by the time you figure it out. I say in the old days, I think some people still do this, but it's very painful on the eyes. You can put your spotting scope on a full moon during migration and count birds, the numbers of birds flying across the path of the moon in a certain period of time. But it really burns your retinas, and I don't recommend it. You can also shine these incredibly bright lights up into the sky, kind of like they do at the 9/11 memorial each year. These incredibly powerful beams, and then you can count the numbers of birds that pass through the beams during a given period of time and get estimates of how many birds are migrating. As I mentioned before, a lot of these nighttime migrants fly very low, and on a cloudy night, they get into all kinds of trouble and really start slamming into things like buildings. And so they've got this campaign. It's called the Fatal Light Awareness Program, or FLAP. So go to flap.org and check it out and see what you can do to help this situation. They're working with big cities like Chicago and New York and Toronto that are right along these migration paths and trying to educate people to turn out those darn office lights at night. They often leave them blaring at night, which further adds to the damage because the birds are attracted to it, kind of like a moth to a flame. And here's just like one night's little kill beneath one of these skyscrapers. You can just pick up dozens and dozens of our favorite migrants on the streets of New York or Toronto during migration. It's really sad. And also, as I've already mentioned, there's just so much more junk now we're putting up into the sky that affects not only migrating birds, but also migrating bats at night. You know, bats have sonar, but even their sonar isn't enough to keep them from hitting these new obstructions that are in their path. So in 1918, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was passed to partner with Canada, because a lot of birds that pass through the US, of course, go to Canada and vice versa. In 1934, we passed the Migratory Bird Hunting Act and enacted the duck stamp, which raises money for conservation. So you can buy a duck stamp every year and help the cause at your post office. And then in 2000, we did an update on the 1918 Act to partner with our neighboring countries to the south, because of course, a lot of our birds that we think of as our birds aren't really our birds. They actually belong more to Central and South America. And so the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act is a partnership between the United States and countries to the south of us to help birds on their wintering grounds. And there's a lot of books that have been written about bird migration that you can read and find out more. And you can also do your part by making your yard, your own backyard, a place where birds might want to stop. So enhance your yard, make it a wildlife habitat. I can help you with that. You can contact me after the class. I'll be happy to help you with ideas on how to make your yard a more bird-friendly place, and birds will use it during their migration. I think that's the end. It's so quiet.
Kurt, we had a question in the chat earlier. Somebody asked if there's a birding app available, and Diana chimed in and mentioned the Merlin Bird ID, but do you have any other apps you'd recommend?
Yeah, there's so many fantastic apps now. Merlin is a great one. So you can start there. I use the Sibley Birds of North America app, SIBLEY, so you can look into that one. National Geographic has one. I have it, but then it didn't update on my phone, so I can't use it anymore. So, but I assume they have a new version now you can get. So National Geographic should have one. The Peterson Field Guide series has one. You can do Peterson. Yeah, we can talk about that on the weekend too. And most of these apps cost about $20, so they're pretty reasonable. So if you want to unmute yourselves and ask questions, you can do that. Again, I'll hang around till the last person disappears and all questions are answered. But I do thank you for your attention, and again, look forward to seeing you Saturday morning. I'll get there before 7:15. I should be there by 7, hopefully, maybe earlier. And yeah, we'll start assembling around 7:15.
Looking forward to it, Kurt.
I have a couple questions.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, one, the field guide, I think you include in the syllabus, is that available at that nature store? Do you know?
Can you remind me which? Oh, I think it says the National Geographic Field Guide.
Yes, I believe so.
Yes, it should be available. And they're up to the 7th edition now. So let's make sure the bookstore has the 7th edition. If they don't, I would wait and get the 7th.
Okay. And then I think there's a couple of us that might take the class for course credit. Is there some type of homework component you'll provide?
Yeah, oh, I can talk more about that on Saturday, but basically you should plan on taking field notes. So bring a little notebook.
Okay.
And then there'll be a little quiz that I'll send you after the weekend, and a little homework assignment you'll have.
Sounds good.
But for now, plan on taking field notes.
Gotcha.
The rest of you who aren't taking it for credit, you don't have to take field notes, but you can if you want. I always recommend it. Any other questions?
Yeah, okay. I have another one.
Yeah, go.
Are you so I understand you are very knowledgeable on birds, but how are you like with plants? Like, do you have any interest in any of the local botany there, and will you have input as we go?
I do have a lot of interest in plants. I probably know more than the average person, but it's not my specialty. But I know a fair number of plants, and we'll certainly talk about some of them. And there may be some people in the group too who know some things about plants as well. But I can hold my own with the plants. You know, I consider myself a naturalist, so I delve into everything nature. Birds happen to be my specialty, and insects are probably my second specialty. So I'm pretty good with those guys too, bugs. And reptiles, not bad with those either.
Great, I think that's it for me.
Okay.
Thanks, Kurt. I'll see everybody on Saturday.
Yeah, thank you all.
All right.
Again, I'll hang around if anybody
Thank
has
you,
more
Kurt.
questions. Otherwise, have a great night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.